Multiplying integers. When we're multiplying integers, there are three rules we always need to remember. The first one is a positive times a positive is always a positive. Then we see a positive times a negative is always a negative. And a negative times a negative is always a positive. So let's practice some of that. Let's look at the first one. Positive times a positive. And this is what we've always done. So we've got 5 times 4. So we see that both of these numbers are positives. So our answer is always going to be positive 20. Or we've got 3 times 4. Since both of these numbers are positive, our answer will also be positive. 3 times 4 is 12, and it is positive 12. Remember, we don't need to put a positive sign in front of the number because we know they're positive if they don't have a negative sign in front of it. Now let's look at the same thing, but now we've got a positive times a negative. So what if we had 5 times negative 4? Well, our rule says that a positive times a negative is always a negative. So we know that 5 times 4 is 20, okay, because that doesn't change. What changes is the sign. So it's going to be negative 20 because a positive times a negative equals a negative. What if we had negative 5? This doesn't look like 5. Negative 5 times 4. Okay, so again, notice that we don't have a sign in front of the 4, so we know it's a positive 4. So 5 times 4 is 20, but because we have a negative times a positive, it's always going to be negative. What about 3 times negative 4? Again, same thing. The number, the total is always going to be 12 because 3 times 4 is 12. But we have a negative and we have a positive number here. So we said a positive times a negative times a positive is always a negative. Same thing if this was a negative 3 times 4. We know the 4 is a positive. It doesn't have a sign in front of it. And we've got a negative 3, so we have a negative times a positive. So negative times a positive or a positive times a negative is always a negative. So this would be negative 12. And our last set are the negatives. So negative times a negative is always a positive. So if we had the same numbers, but this time it would be negative 5 times a negative 4. That means we have two negatives. That's a negative times a negative. Our answer will be 20 because 5 times 4 is 20. And if we follow the rules that a negative times a negative is a positive, it would be positive 20. We don't have to put a sign in front of it. What if we had negative 3 times negative 4? Again, we look at our signs. Our signs matter. Our answer will always be whatever that multiplication gives us. So 3 times 4 is 12. It's a matter of the signs. Is it going to be a negative 12 or a positive 12? Well, we've got a negative times a negative equals a positive, so it's going to be positive 12. Let's do one more. What if we had 7 negative times 3 negative? So we know it's going to be 21 because our multiplication is not going to change. 3 times 7 is 21. We care about the signs. We've got a negative and a negative, which equals a positive. So it would be positive 21. Let's practice what we've learned so far. So we've got a few questions here, and we're going to determine if we should have a positive or a negative in our result. So we have 6 times negative 8. This 6 is a positive 6 because it doesn't have a negative sign in front of it. So we've got a positive times a negative. What are we going to get? So we know it's going to be 48 because 6 times 8 is 48. Is it going to be negative 48 or positive 48? Well, we look at our rules here. We know that a positive times a positive is a positive. Oh, a positive times a negative equals a negative. So this is going to be negative 48 because we have a positive and we've got a negative. What about 4 times 7? So we know that it's going to be 28, because 4 times 7 is 28, but is it going to be positive or negative 28? Well, when we look at our numbers, what do we see? We have a positive 4 and a positive 7. And when we look at our rules, we know that a positive times a positive equals a positive. That means that our answer will be positive 28. We'll leave it as this. Okay, what about this one? We've got negative 5 times 3. So we know that we're going to have 15 because 5 times 3 is 15, but is it going to be negative or is it going to be positive? Well, we look at our numbers and we see that we have a negative 5 and we have a positive 3. Okay, so a negative times a positive equals a negative, which is the same thing as a positive times a negative. So that would be negative 15. And what do we have? Negative 8 times negative 3. So we know that our answer is going to be 24 because 8 times 3 is 24, but is it going to be a negative or a positive? Well, we've got negative 8 and negative 3. That's two negatives. A negative times a negative equals a positive. So we've got positive 24. Okay, I wanted to try something a little bit more tricky because now we have more than just two numbers to multiply. And so we've got 3 times negative 2 times 2 times negative 2. So we've got lots of negatives in there and lots of positives. So the best way to do this is to take this step by step by doing 2 at a time. So we've got 3 times negative 2. So we've got a positive 3 times a negative 2. And so we know that 3 times 2 equals 6. But is it negative 6 or positive 6? Well, we've got a positive times a negative, which always equals a negative. And now we're just going to bring down the rest of the question. We're not going to do anything now. We're just going to rewrite what we already have. Perfect. Now we're going to do the next 2, which are these. And we've got negative 6 times 2. We know that it's going to be 12. But is it going to be positive 12 or negative 12? Well, we've got a negative, and our 2 here is a positive. So a negative times a positive equals a negative. Okay. And we bring down the rest of the question down without doing anything else. Okay. And so to end this, we've got a negative 12 times a negative 2. So we know we're going to have a 24 because 12 times 2 is 24. But is it a negative 24 or a positive 24? Well, we've got a negative and we've got a negative. Negative times a negative equals positive. So our answer is positive 24.